soon as you said that, it made me think they had a interview with Boosie that came out on the Breakfast Club, and he kept talking about God. And I'm like, now he's going to jail, you're talking about God.
That's where God wanted him to go.
Charleston has never been afraid to call out Boosie, and for years the tension between them had been openly hostile. This was not a quiet disagreement or a misunderstanding that faded with time. It was loud, public, and sustained, with both sides trading insults and threats across platforms. But this time, the situation crossed a line that could not be easily walked back. What had once been a war of words suddenly moved into territory that felt far more serious, far more volatile. When Charleston directed his attacks toward Tootie Raw, Boosie's son, the dynamic shifted immediately. Boosie was not willing to treat this as just more internet noise. The reaction was explosive, and the fallout was severe. After Charleston White shot back at Tootie Raw publicly, the conflict escalated into what many would later describe as the most dangerous moment in the long-running Charleston White-Boosie feud. Family members were no longer background figures. They had become direct targets. What had once been a clash between two public personalities now felt personal, emotional, and increasingly reckless. Tootie Raw, Boosie's son, whose real name is Torrance Taylor, found himself pulled directly into the conflict after defending his father online. His responses to Charleston's constant attacks followed a pattern that felt familiar, almost learned. There was anger in his words. There were threats. It was the kind of language often used to answer disrespect in the environments he had grown up around. In that moment, the dispute stopped being about two adults with opposing worldviews and became something far more unstable. This was no longer a single-generation dispute. It had turned into a multi-generational confrontation, where threats, arrests, and accusations of coordination with law enforcement moved from the margins to the center of the story. Tootie Raw was around 19 or 20 years old when he began sending messages to Charleston White, pushing back against the ongoing attacks on his father. He was young, emotional, and acting out of loyalty, but his involvement changed everything. The messages he sent were aggressive. They included insults, demands for White to stay quiet, and even statements expressing hope that White would die. These were the exact kinds of responses Charleston's provocations were known to provoke, but they also introduced a new and dangerous element into the situation. Once a son stepped into the fight, the rules shifted, and Charleston's response reflected that shift immediately.
So we really don't believe our knowledge. Because if we did, there's no way we wouldn't act on it. Your knowledge is transforming, and it makes you seek the path to understand your knowledge so you can execute through wisdom. Most know a bunch of shit, but can't execute it.
White did not frame Tootie Raw as a teenager speaking out of anger or as a young man deserving leniency because of his age or loyalty to his family. Instead, he treated him as a full participant who had knowingly entered a hostile conflict. In Charleston's framing, that decision meant adult consequences. There was no grace period and no softening of tone. Charleston White publicly claimed responsibility for Tootie Raw's arrest. On Instagram Live, he stated that he personally reported Tootie to authorities. He described sending photos and information to Texas state troopers and alerting them to what he described as Tootie's activities. He did not hesitate or hedge his words, said it plainly, without shame or apology. "I'm the one who had the police lock him up." For most figures connected to hip-hop culture, admission like that would be unthinkable. Openly claiming cooperation with law enforcement has historically been treated as a career-ending stigma. But Charleston White had already separated himself from those cultural rules. He had never pretended to operate within the so-called G-code. By openly rejecting it, he positioned himself as someone who could use the system without claiming loyalty to street ethics he said he never believed in. White framed his actions as consistent with his identity as what he called a law-abiding citizen. From his perspective, using law enforcement against someone who threatened him was not betrayal. It was strategy, was not violating a code because, in his view, he was never bound by it in the first place. That distinction allowed him to move openly, even proudly, in ways that others would avoid at all costs. In September 2025, Charleston White went even further. He claimed that Tootie Raw had been arrested again, this time in Atlanta. According to White, the arrest involved possession of a Glock equipped with a switch, a modification that can convert a semi-automatic handgun into something closer to fully automatic fire. White alleged that the arrest occurred within hours of his arrival in the city, implying coordination between his movements and law enforcement response. The claim has never been officially substantiated. No public records have conclusively confirmed the details as White described them. But the significance was not only in whether the claim was true, it was in White's willingness to say it publicly. Once again, he presented himself as someone entirely comfortable being seen as a man who would weaponize the authorities against his enemies, even when those enemies were the children of the men he feuded with. The threats Charleston White directed at Tootie Raw grew more explicit and more disturbing as the conflict dragged on. What began as verbal provocation hardened into warnings of real-world violence. White openly suggested that Tootie could be smoked or shot if the confrontation continued. He framed these statements not as aggression, but as preparation, repeatedly positioning any future violence as self-defense. In his telling, he was merely responding to threats and would be justified in using lethal force if necessary. One of his most chilling statements was delivered directly toward Boosie White. Said Boosie might have to bury his son before ever leaving prison. The comment was layered. It combined a prediction of Tootie's death with a reminder of Boosie's ongoing legal exposure. It was not just a threat. It was psychological pressure, tying family loss to incarceration in a way meant to destabilize and provoke.
Now White did not stop with Tootie.
He expanded his attacks to Boosie's wider family across multiple Instagram lives and interviews. He referenced Boosie's newborn child and other relatives, pulling them into the public crossfire. He spoke about Boosie's legal troubles in terms that emphasized family separation, expressing hope for outcomes that would keep Boosie away from his children. In some instances, he went further, invoking Boosie's diabetes and openly wishing for health complications that could prove fatal while incarcerated. This strategy marked White's most controversial and dangerous escalation. Hip-hop beef has long operated with unofficial boundaries. Artists attack each other's credibility, talent, and character. But family members, especially children, are traditionally considered off-limits.
I see you are in comedy or on your comedy tour with Woody.
Three going on. This will be the third straight year.
Hey,
So I've done over 400 comedy shows.
Why comedy tours?
Because I didn't know what to do. I was on the internet home frustrated, saying I'm gonna come play a character, and I'm gonna use my frustration, my education, my knowledge, my theatrical skill.
White did not merely cross that line. He erased it. Family vulnerability became central to his attacks. Not collateral damage, but the focal point of his pressure campaign. Boosie's response to this escalation was strikingly restrained, especially given the image he has cultivated throughout his career. He warned White repeatedly not to involve his family and made it clear that crossing that boundary would bring consequences. But at the same time, he emphasized that he was deliberately avoiding full engagement. He framed his restraint as a matter of survival, freedom, and long-term success. Boosie openly acknowledged keeping White's name out of his mouth. He described direct confrontation as a threat to everything he had built, financially and personally. This choice created a strange and uncomfortable dynamic. A rapper whose reputation was built on aggression and defiance was now stepping back while another man publicly attacked his children. Charleston White seized on that restraint. He used it as proof in his view that Boosie's image was performative. According to White, when faced with someone who genuinely did not fear consequences, Boosie revealed himself as more concerned with preservation than with the street principles he claimed to represent. This interpretation became central to White's narrative. White framed the conflict through his own philosophical lens, drawing distinctions between knowledge and wisdom, between talking and doing. He argued that many men spoke about power, violence, and codes, but were unwilling to act when reality demanded sacrifice. In contrast, he presented himself as someone who followed through on his beliefs, regardless of how unpopular or destructive that made him appear. From his perspective, cooperating with law enforcement, issuing public threats, and even targeting family members were not contradictions. They were proof of authenticity. He believed these actions demonstrated that he meant what he said, while others hid behind carefully managed personas. In White's framing, hesitation exposed weakness. The origins of the feud predated these extreme moments. The conflict can be traced back to late 2022, when Boosie publicly criticized Kanye West for wearing a White Lives Matter shirt. Charleston White responded by attacking Boosie for speaking on Kanye at all. That exchange lit the fuse for what would become years of escalation. But even then, White suggested his hostility toward Boosie was rooted in something deeper than a single disagreement. Something unresolved that would continue to surface as the conflict intensified. Charleston White has repeatedly pointed to Boosie's alleged treatment of Marlo Mike as the emotional core of the entire conflict. Marlo Mike, an associate convicted in a 2012 murder case, is described by White as someone Boosie allegedly used and then abandoned. When White speaks about Marlo Mike, his tone shifts. The anger becomes personal. He frames the situation as a betrayal that never sat right with him, suggesting that this is where his resentment truly began. White accuses Boosie of sleeping comfortably while Marlo Mike remains in prison, paying the price for actions that White claims were done in service of others. In White's telling, Boosie moved on with his life, career, and family, while someone who allegedly did work for him was left behind to deal with permanent consequences. This sense of injustice, real or perceived, is what White presents as the real reason the conflict never cooled off. That theme of loyalty, or more precisely, the accusation of disloyalty, ties together many of White's actions. The attacks on family, the trolling related to federal cases, and the repeated accusations of G-code hypocrisy are all presented as extensions of the same argument. In White's view, Boosie represents a type of figure who benefits from street mythology but abandons people when the consequences become inconvenient.
Ow.
In March 2024, the conflict took another turn. White accused Boosie of threatening a Baton Rouge club promoter, allegedly warning them not to book White for a comedy show and implying consequences if they did. According to White, this was an attempt to interfere directly with his livelihood, moving the beef from words into financial retaliation. White's response followed a familiar pattern. He threatened to contact the FBI and local police to get Boosie sent back to prison. He claimed to possess recorded evidence of the threats and presented law enforcement as his chosen countermeasure. Once again, provocation led to escalation. Escalation led to threats, and the conflict expanded rather than resolved. White's comedy career added another layer to the situation. Performs regularly, claims to have completed over 400 shows, and uses his stage presence to blend entertainment with the same. Confrontational commentary that built his online reputation. Comedy, for White, is not an escape from controversy. It is another arena where he applies pressure and tests boundaries. The allegation that Boosie attempted to block his bookings suggested that the conflict was producing real-world consequences.
And it just like that, Boosie cut him off. Went to Lad TV, running, calling the man a snitch, calling all that stuff. Whole album done with T.I. And their kids was friends, hanging out, doing all this stuff. And now it was like, boom, he was cool. I'm not messing with T.I. no more because there's these rat allegations and I'm cool. Now you fast forward a couple years and you're not doing this. You're not keeping that same.
It indicated that people behind the scenes might be growing cautious about associating with either man. The beef was no longer contained to screens and interviews. It was affecting business decisions. White has openly acknowledged the theatrical aspects of his persona. He has said that he studied drama, understands performance, and knows how attention works. He admits to playing roles. But he draws a hard line between what he describes as deliberate performance and what he accuses others of doing. In his framing, he owns his exaggerations, while Boosie and others hide behind personas they refuse to admit are constructed. As of early February 2026, there has still been no direct physical confrontation between Charleston White and Boosie. Viral posts joking about a Netflix boxing match or a fight night dated. April 1st, 2026 are clearly satire or clickbait, not serious plans. The conflict continues in the same ways it always has. Through interviews, social media posts, reactions to legal developments, and the constant resurfacing of older clips that platforms push to new audiences. The family warfare aspect remains the most dangerous dimension of the feud. Tootie Raw's legal troubles, regardless of how they originated, carry long-term consequences for a young person's future. The exchange of threats between adults has created an atmosphere where violence feels possible, even if it has not occurred. More concerning is the precedent set by openly using law enforcement as a weapon in personal disputes. That tactic, once normalized, can be copied. In other conflicts, the outcomes could be far worse. Observers have noted that White's willingness to cross lines most people avoid has made him a unique figure in hip-hop controversy. His influence does not come from respecting the culture's norms, but from rejecting them entirely. Whether that rejection represents courage, sociopathy, or simply effective marketing depends on perspective. Different audiences draw different conclusions based on their own values and experiences. What is undeniable is that the ongoing conflict with Boosie has given Charleston White years of content, sustained platform growth, and a clearly defined role in larger conversations about accountability, authenticity, and the codes people claim to live by. The conflict shows no signs of resolving on its own. Boosie remains under the weight of 3 years of supervised release, a condition that leaves no room for error. Any misstep, any escalation that crosses a legal line.
First, you talk this street, and from what I understand, in the streets or even in the federal prison system, you have to have paperwork and documentations to show. And one thing we know about being in trouble with the law, part of your constitutional rights, homie, is you have a right to confront your witness.
Carries the risk of serious federal consequences. Charleston White has continued to circle Tootie Raw's legal troubles, treating them as pressure points rather than isolated events. That imbalance has created a stable but dangerous dynamic. White attacks relentlessly, while Boosie absorbs the blows in order to protect his freedom. As long as that equation holds, the conflict can continue indefinitely. The audience has not drifted away. Algorithms continue to surface clips, interviews, and recycled footage, feeding the same confrontation to new viewers. Both men have settled into roles that generate attention, regardless of whether the story ever reaches a definitive conclusion. Each new clip, each resurfaced quote, reinforces the ongoing narrative rather than resolving it. At the center of that narrative sits the concept of the G-code, the unwritten rules of street conduct, the informal constitution of loyalty, silence, and accountability that is supposed to separate authentic figures from frauds. This is the ideological ground where Charleston White has focused his most sustained and damaging attacks on Boosie. White has repeatedly accused Boosie of selectively applying these principles. According to White, Boosie enforces street rules aggressively against some individuals, while offering passes to others based on personal relationships, business interests, or simple convenience. In this framing, the code is not a moral system, but a tool used when it benefits him and ignored when it does not. Those accusations cut directly into the foundation of Boosie's public identity. His brand had been built, in large part, on the idea that his word carried weight, that he lived by a code, that he stood apart from artists who merely performed street authenticity without actually embodying it. White's argument was not that the code itself was meaningless, but that Boosie did not apply it consistently. The Big Meech situation crystallized this critique in a way that made Boosie's position harder to defend. When allegations surfaced connecting Big Meech to cooperation with authorities, the hip-hop community watched closely. This was a test case. Many wanted to see how artists who had built their reputations on strict anti-snitch principles would respond when those principles were challenged by uncomfortable allegations. White seized on Boosie's response as proof of hypocrisy. He contrasted it sharply with Boosie's reaction to T.I.
And went out speculation. And because of that, that's why I tell real street homies, stay off the internet. If you're a real street homie, stay off the internet, man. Don't get caught up into this.
When allegations emerged suggesting possible cooperation by T.I., Boosie acted immediately and publicly. He went on Vlad TV and other platforms to denounce his former friend. He canceled a joint album they had been working on. He severed a relationship that extended beyond music, one that involved their families, their children, and years of shared access. In that case, Boosie did not wait for proof. He did not demand documentation or legal confirmation. Allegations alone were enough to justify cutting ties with someone who had been close enough to share studios and family gatherings. The enforcement of the no-snitch rule was swift and absolute. Big Meech, however, received different treatment. Boosie publicly stated that he was committed to honoring his word and showing up for commitments he had already made. That distinction became the core of White's argument. To White, the difference was not about facts or principles. It was about selective enforcement, about who received grace and who was discarded. This contrast became one of the most powerful weapons in White's ongoing campaign. It allowed him to argue that the G-code was not being upheld as a consistent moral framework, but wielded as leverage. And as long as that accusation remains unresolved, the conflict itself has no natural endpoint. The Welcome Home Big Meech concert became the clearest symbol of what Charleston White described as selective enforcement. Boosie was willing to appear, willing to perform, willing to lend his credibility and platform to someone facing allegations similar to the ones that had ended his relationship with T.I. That contrast was impossible to ignore. White seized on it as confirmation of everything he had been arguing from the beginning. In White's framing, the street code Boosie claimed to live by was never a fixed set of principles. It was a facade. A flexible rulebook pulled out when useful and discarded when inconvenient. Boosie's radically different treatment of T.I. and Big Meech, according to White, demonstrated that the code functioned less as a moral compass and more as a weapon. It was used to punish enemies while shielding friends, justified after the fact by loyalty rather than consistency. White's position outside the street framework gave him room to attack it in ways insiders could not.
As soon as you said that, it made me think they had a interview with Boosie that came out on the Breakfast Club, and he kept talking about God. And I'm like, now he's going to jail, you talking about God.
That's where God wanted him to go. God wanted a relationship with you. So he sent you to jail so y'all can talk. Any other time you hoe, get your put X pills in girl booties. Tootie, come in here and put your mouth. And you ain't hollering God then. So God wanted his time.
By openly identifying as a law-abiding citizen and rejecting street rules altogether, he removed himself from the burden of proving who did or did not cooperate with authorities. He did not need to establish whether Big Meech was a snitch. He did not need to rule on the validity of allegations against T.I. His argument operated at a higher level, pointing out that the loudest defenders of the code were often the first to violate it when their interests were at stake. The Terrence Gangster Williams situation added another layer to this critique. Williams, the half-brother of Cash Money co-founders Birdman and Slim, faced his own accusations after helping authorities close cold cases while serving a life sentence that spanned more than 2 decades. Boosie publicly labeled Williams a snitch, arguing that his cooperation made Birdman and the Cash Money brand look bad. But White emphasized a critical distinction. The individuals Williams allegedly provided information about were already deceased. No living person was indicted. No additional prison time resulted. No new prosecutions followed. The consequences were historical rather than immediate. In White's view, this made the outrage performative rather than principled. White contrasted Boosie's condemnation of Williams with his defense of Big Meech. One man was attacked for helping clarify old cases involving dead individuals, while another was protected despite allegations that could have affected living people. According to White, that contradiction only made sense if the street code was never truly about justice or loyalty. It was about power, about who had the authority to decide who wore the snitch label and who was granted immunity. White pointed to constitutional ideas as a counterweight to this system. The right to confront accusers, the right to see evidence, the expectation of proof. Even within street culture, he argued, labeling someone a snitch without documentation was reckless. The fact that mere allegations could destroy one person's reputation while another received protection exposed what he saw as the code's fundamental corruption. This argument extended far beyond Boosie as an individual. White was aiming at hip-hop culture itself. He suggested that the entire structure of street credibility, the rules, the rituals, and the language of authenticity functioned largely as performance. Artists adopted these postures to build brands, sell records, and project toughness. But when those codes collided with money, friendships, or business alliances, they were quietly abandoned. By framing the conflict this way, White positioned himself as something unfamiliar within hip-hop discourse. Not a participant fighting over who followed the rules better, but an outsider questioning whether the rules ever truly existed as anything more than a convenient illusion. Charleston White positioned himself as a figure willing to call out the performance itself, not by competing for authenticity, but by rejecting the entire framework outright. He did not argue that he was more street than Boosie. He did not claim superior standing in the game, nor did he attempt to establish credibility through stories of past criminal behavior. Instead, He argued that the system everyone was defending was fundamentally dishonest. In White's view, openly rejecting the street code was more honest than pretending to follow it while constantly carving out exceptions for friends, allies, and business partners. He framed his position as transparency rather than rebellion. By refusing to play the role at all, he claimed moral clarity over those who performed adherence while selectively breaking the rules when it suited them. White's repeated advice that real street figures should stay off the internet carried particular weight in this context. He argued that the social media era had made the code impossible to maintain consistently. The scrutiny was too intense, the documentation too permanent. Statements were recorded, clipped, reposted, and archived indefinitely. Who said what, when, and about whom could always be retrieved. The contradictions could no longer be buried or explained away. Boosie's inconsistency, White argued, was not unique. It was inevitable. It was what happened when street posturing collided with internet permanence. Statements made years earlier could be instantly compared with statements made days ago. The archive never forgot, and the audience never stopped searching. Hypocrisy was no longer hidden. It was hunted. Then came the federal case, the moment that reignited the conflict at its most dangerous level. The federal courthouse in San Diego became the real-world setting for what Charleston White had been predicting for years. When the news broke, White moved quickly, positioning himself as someone who had seen the outcome long before the paperwork was filed. Boosie, whose real name is Torrance Hatch Jr., faced federal charges for being a felon in possession of a firearm and ammunition.
Now the charges carried a potential maximum sentence up to 15 years behind bars.
A number White repeated frequently and without restraint across multiple platforms.
Oh,
His tone made clear that he viewed this not as tragedy, but as validation. This was not state court, where plea negotiations are more flexible and sentences are often shaped by overcrowded jails and overburdened systems. This was the federal system where conviction rates exceed 90%, system where plea deals often feel less like negotiations and more like surrender, offering limited concessions in exchange for certainty. The case traced back to a 2023 incident in San Diego, California. What initially appeared to be a routine encounter escalated into charges that would later dominate headlines and fuel Charleston White's commentary. Over the next 2 years, federal prosecutors took control from state authorities, elevating what might have remained a manageable state case into a federal nightmare. For Boosie, the implications were severe. Federal court demanded entirely different legal strategies and carried consequences far beyond anything state proceedings typically impose. This escalation was especially dangerous given his history, prior legal trouble, probation issues, and a public persona built around street credibility. All of it now stood in direct conflict with the reality of federal prosecution. In White's narrative, this moment was not random. It was the collision of performance and permanence, of internet bravado meeting a system that does not care about reputation or mythology, and once that collision occurred, there was no way to talk it down. Being caught with a firearm triggered consequences that left little room for maneuvering. Mandatory minimums and federal sentencing guidelines sharply limited judicial discretion. In the federal system, firearm possession by someone already classified as prohibited is treated as a serious public safety issue. The government does not approach these cases casually, and once the machinery starts moving, it rarely slows down. Boosie found himself facing the full weight of federal prosecutorial resources deployed with focus and persistence. Charleston White watched these developments unfold with a sense of inevitability. He spoke about the case like someone collecting on a wager placed years earlier. His commentary became relentless, precise, and intentionally cutting. Every appearance, every clip, was delivered with theatrical control. White understood not only the legal stakes, but how to frame them in a way that maximized attention while reinforcing his long-standing narrative. In an interview posted on January 11, 2026, White dissected Boosie's legal situation in striking detail. His analysis suggested close attention to court filings and procedural steps. He framed the case around what he saw as Boosie's core miscalculation, the belief that fame, money, and street credibility could somehow insulate him from federal consequences. White argued that this belief had been fatal. He repeatedly emphasized that the federal system operates under entirely different rules. Relationships that carry influence in Baton Rouge mean nothing once U.S. attorneys take control. Intimidation tactics lose their value. Reputation does not enter the equation, according to White. This disconnect was what left Boosie exposed once the case moved beyond state jurisdiction. That exposure became official on August 26, 2025, when Boosie formally pleaded guilty to one count of being a felon in possession of a firearm and ammunition. In exchange for the plea, prosecutors agreed to drop a second gun charge and committed to recommending a 2-year prison sentence. While far below the statutory maximum, it still represented significant time for someone whose career and income depend on constant output and visibility. White treated the plea as validation. To him, it was confirmation of years of warnings about accountability catching up to image. He framed the moment as a partial victory in his broader campaign against what he viewed as hip-hop's glorification of street culture without consequences. In his telling, the system had finally responded. But the sentencing process introduced uncertainty. Federal probation officials initially calculated a guideline range closer to 46 months, just under 4 years. That recommendation exceeded even what prosecutors had agreed to, creating a window where Boosie could face harsher punishment than his plea suggested. Prosecutors ultimately filed their official recommendation on January 2, 2026, standing by the 2-year sentence they had promised. Boosie's defense team, led by attorney Megan Blanco, pushed in the opposite direction. They filed a sentencing memorandum arguing against prison time entirely. Instead, they requested 2 years of structured probation and 300 hours of community service. The defense argued that Boosie had already endured significant punishment through the process itself. The arrest, the pretrial detention, the damage to his reputation, the disruption to his career. According to their filing, these consequences had already imposed a heavy cost, one they argued should be taken into account as the court weighed its final decision. The defense highlighted Boosie's efforts to mentor young people and emphasized his stated desire to focus on family responsibilities moving forward. They presented these factors as evidence of growth and rehabilitation. Charleston White responded to those arguments with open derision. He dismissed the idea that a convicted felon caught with a firearm should walk away without additional prison time. He questioned whether that same mercy would ever be extended to someone without Boosie's resources, fame, or access to elite legal representation. White positioned himself as a voice for those who encounter the criminal justice system without insulation. People without platforms, without money, without attorneys capable of reframing consequences as character development. In his framing, the defense narrative was not about rehabilitation, but about privilege, about outcomes shaped by status rather than standards. The January 9, 2026 sentencing hearing produced a result that surprised nearly everyone involved. U.S. District Judge Kathy Ann Benchavengo sentenced Boosie to time served. 3 years of supervised release, 300 hours of community service, and a $50,000 fine. There was no additional prison time. The sentence aligned far more closely with the defense's request than with the prosecution's recommendation. White's reaction exposed the complexity of his investment in the conflict. On one level, the case had already delivered what he wanted: months of content, sustained audience attention, confirmation that Boosie was facing serious federal exposure. The spectacle itself had validated much of White's commentary. But the final outcome complicated that narrative. The absence of a prison sentence undercut White's repeated predictions of a severe federal reckoning. White reframed the result through a moral and spiritual lens. He suggested that Boosie's public appeals to faith during the legal process were less about transformation and more about convenience. In White's telling, the sudden embrace of religiosity in court stood in contrast to the music, messaging, and lifestyle Boosie continued to promote publicly. He argued that if divine intervention was at work, it had arrived not as mercy, but as consequence. The legal process itself, in White's view, was meant to force reflection. The federal case became more than a courtroom outcome. It became a symbol within White's broader argument about accountability, about the distance between street image and real-world consequences, and about the selective enforcement of codes within hip-hop culture. Every filing, every hearing, every procedural update became fuel for White's ongoing commentary. Boosie's camp responded very differently. His attorney issued statements centered on gratitude and the opportunity to move forward. The tone was restrained and forward-looking. Boosie himself addressed the case only briefly in interviews and consistently avoided mentioning White by name. The strategy appeared deliberate. By refusing to engage directly, Boosie denied White the validation that comes from public confrontation, but that silence had consequences of its own. White treated the lack of response as evidence. In his framing, it showed avoidance rather than discipline. He argued that Boosie lacked the willingness to confront criticism directly and preferred to let legal outcomes speak in his place. Each absence became another talking point. Each refusal to respond was reframed as confirmation. The federal gun case revealed something fundamental about how this conflict functions. It showed why the feud continues to generate attention long after the original provocation should have faded. The story is not sustained by resolution. It is sustained by imbalance, by one side applying pressure relentlessly and the other choosing restraint, creating a vacuum that commentary rushes to fill. Charleston White's position requires momentum. He needs material. He needs developments. He needs new angles to keep the content machine moving and the algorithms continuing to feed his platforms. Boosie's legal troubles supplied that material in steady, uninterrupted waves. They offered real events involving a real person, removing any need for exaggeration or invention. White did not have to create controversy. He only had to comment on what was already unfolding in public view. Every hearing became usable. Every filing carried narrative weight. Every judicial decision provided a fresh opportunity for interpretation and reframing. White treated the legal process itself as serialized content, breaking it down piece by piece, assigning meaning, intent, and consequence to each development. Because Boosie had already been established as his primary target, the audience followed naturally. The story had continuity. The stakes were understood. This structure allowed White to operate efficiently. The court supplied the raw material, supplied the commentary. The conflict sustained itself without escalation or resolution. Each update reinforced earlier claims, keeping the narrative alive without requiring new provocations. It was commentary anchored in reality, which gave it durability and credibility with his audience. In that sense, the federal case did more than shape Boosie's future. It extended the lifespan of the feud itself. As long as consequences unfolded publicly, there was always something to analyze, something to frame, something to point to as proof that the story was not over, only evolving. The conflict does not end with closure. It ends when attention moves elsewhere. And for now, the structure remains intact. Thanks for watching. Check out the other cards on your screen.